Secretary Gates, thank you very much for your lifetime of service to our country and its national security interest, in particular your 4.5 years as a wartime Secretary of Defense when your actions saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I appreciate it. In those many years as a leader in America's national security establishment, can you recall a time when our strategic interests were as threatened as they are today across the Eurasian supercontinent?
Well, I think, we have, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks, every decade has had a variety of challenges. I think it's probably fair to say that we've not had as many challenges in as many and widespread parts of the world as we do today. That the occasions that has happened have been pretty rare, I think.
The one country that spans across the entire continent and has a global interest, you might say, like the United States, is Russia. Given some of Russia's recent provocations, not just in Europe but in the Middle East, do you think that as part of defense reform we should relook at our basing structures in Europe to include the possibility of moving permanently stationed troops to the front lines of NATO, the Baltics, if not Poland?
I think that we need to increase, well, first of all, let me say I agree with the steps that have been taken to increase the presence of NATO and U.S. forces in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and in the Baltic states. I think the idea of having equipment sets, as the Pentagon is thinking about, has a lot of merit in terms of having the equipment already pre-positioned in Europe. I think I would work very closely with our NATO partners in terms of the wisdom of having permanent U.S. bases in Poland or in the Baltic states. There is always the risk of taking a step too far and creating a consequence that you were trying to prevent in the first place. And as in the case of Eastern Ukraine, the Russians have a lot more capability and a lot shorter supply lines in that area than we do. But I think enhancing the defensive patrolling out of the air patrolling out of the Baltic states, challenging Russian aircraft when they come up and go beyond where they should go, and having regular exercises in Eastern Europe. The truth is, Putin has provoked all of this. Our allies, when I was secretary back in 2008, 2009, when the United States would propose having an exercise in Poland or in the Baltic states, our NATO counterparts wanted no part of it. So one of the things Putin has achieved is to create enough alarm in Europe that our allies are now willing to participate with us in those kinds of forward operations. So I guess what I'm saying is I totally support advanced kit being over there. I totally support the rotational presence and increased presence of our forces and other NATO forces on a rotational basis. I think whether you want to go to permanent basis is a tougher question.
Okay. Another thing that Vladimir Putin has done, especially in the last month, is display some of his advances in missile technology to go along with the boasts he's made. The United States in recent years has accused Russia of developing a nuclear ground-launched cruise missile in violation of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Given that Vladimir Putin already has nuclear weapons that hold all of Europe at risk, why do you think he would be considering developing such a missile? What does that tell us about the way he conceives his nuclear strategy as part of his overall security strategy?
The Russian defense minister, as early as 2007, approached me about doing away with the INF treaty. And he said, the irony is the United States and Russia are the only countries that cannot have intermediate range missiles. Now, he said, now, of course, if we do away with it, we would not put those missiles in the West. We'll put them in the South and in the East, meaning Iran and China. I wasn't sure I believed that at the time, but But so they've been interested in getting out of this treaty for several years. And just as we unilaterally walked away from the ABM treaty early in the second Bush administration, it would not surprise me in the least to see Russia walk away from the INF treaty and have the opportunity to deploy more of these missiles.
And should we, A, consider their offer and abrogate the INF treaty, and B, regardless, should we consider to begin the development of new nuclear warheads that would be smaller and more versatile to counter the threat that Vladimir Putin is beginning to pose?
Well, theoretically, my answer would be yes, but I would tell you, practically speaking, I spent virtually the entire 4.5 years that I was Secretary of Defense trying to get the first the executive branch and then the Congress to figure out a way to modernize the nuclear weapons we already have. That effort was a signal failure. So if I have to have a priority on developing nuclear weapons, it would be to modernize the ones we already have to make them safer and more reliable rather than building new ones.
Thank you. Beginning, the least sincere statement in a hearing like this is, Mr. Chairman, I'm ready for your questions. Perhaps the least welcome statement is, I have a few more questions. Just two, though. When we were talking earlier, you said that theoretically you think that we would need to modernize our nuclear warheads, build new ones, maybe smaller, more versatile. That's a debate we can have. But practically, you had the devil's own time of just modernizing the warheads that we had. Why do you think that is?
Well, to be honest about it, there was a great deal of resistance, both within the administration, this administration, and here on the Hill, to allocating the funds for modernizing our nuclear enterprise at a time when the political aspiration is to get rid of nuclear weapons. It was seen as the U.S. trying to improve or enhance our nuclear capabilities, when in reality what we were proposing was not any additional nuclear weapons, but simply rather trying to make the ones that we already have more reliable and safer than the very old designs that we have deployed today. It's a very expensive proposition, but I actually allocated within the defense budget about $4.5 billion that would go to the nuclear enterprise at the Department of Energy. But at the end of the day, it all fell apart. But it was part of the deal, actually, that was made with the passage of the most recent Strategic Arms Agreement. Part of the deal that was made was that we would modernize a good bit of the nuclear enterprise in exchange for support for going forward with the newest arms control agreement. The trouble is, to the best of my knowledge, and as I say, I've been gone 4 years, but to the best of my knowledge, there has been no forward progress on that modernization effort.
Since you pursued this effort despite the political headwinds, presumably you believe there are a few things more important than a safe and reliable nuclear deterrent for our president to have?
Well, there is nothing more important than that.
Thank you. Final question. The Goldwater-Nichols Act reorganized the Department of Defense to improve the quality of strategy, policy plans, and military advice for civilian leaders. Do you think the organization set up by Goldwater-Nichols provided you with the best possible ideas, options, and advice while you were Secretary of Defense?
I would say that the policy papers and the planning that I received both from the office, from the Undersecretary for Policy, under both President Bush and President Obama, were first-rate. That organization was led under President Bush by Eric Edelman, by Michelle Flournoy under President Obama, and I thought I got very high-quality work from them. I thought that on the military side, I got very good planning and very good advice from the Joint Staff and from the combatant commanders. I think that the one place where the gap between resources and strategy begins to diverge is every 4 years when we do the quadrennial defense review. And too often, the quadrennial defense review, which is kind of what our strategy ought to be to implement, what our military approach ought to be to implementing the President's national security strategy, gets divorced from the budget realities. And therefore, I think that reduces the value of the quadrennial defense review. When we did the one in 2010, we tried to bring those two back closer together, but we didn't entirely succeed.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you, not just from me, but on behalf of all my colleagues and the citizens we serve, but most importantly, the men and women of our armed forces who you led for 4.5 years of war and whose lives you helped save.
Thank
This
you.
hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.